Hey everybody, Red Diamonds Too Loyal, back again with another video. Today we're reacting to 3 true creepy predator horror stories from Anna Horror Stories. This video was once again requested, guys. Let's get into it.
When I was in college, I was attending a university in Washington, just a couple of hours away from my hometown. I was studying to be an English teacher, and my boyfriend Charlie was an environmental science major. Charlie had a project coming up that required him to gather rock and soil samples and would write a report on them. To do this, he was planning a weekend camping trip in a forest not far from our campus. His buddy Jake from his class was going to be coming along. When Charlie asked me to join him and Jake, I was completely against the idea of it at first. It was November, so it was pretty chilly out, and it was always raining in Washington. But I could see how much this meant to Charlie and how much he wanted me to go. He was always supportive of me and all of
What if Charlie's the creep? Just saying.
my studies, and I wanted to do the same for him. So I told him I would go. When I tell you a camping trip is probably the worst activity I can imagine doing over a weekend, I mean it. I have always hated it with such a passion. I can't stand the bugs, the mud, or the fact that there are no restrooms. Plus, we would be out in the middle of nowhere where we would have literally no cell service. To say I'm addicted to my phone is putting it lightly, so this was going to be tough for me. Of course, I didn't tell any of this to Charlie. He was so happy gathering up all the supplies we were going to need for the trip. As we walked through the local sports and supplies store to pick out a tent and outdoor cooking supplies, he had a huge smile on his face. He was rambling on and on and on about different types of soil and samples of things he was hoping to find during our trip. I nodded along and tried to seem like I was as excited as he was. He was truly the best boyfriend who would do anything for me at the drop of a hat. I thought about the countless nights he spent helping me make flashcards for one of my upcoming tests instead of watching football with his friends, or there were times he woke up extra early to get
He seems a little too perfect, don't y'all think?
me a Starbucks coffee and bring it to me at my dorm before class. A couple of days getting rained on in the woods was the least I could do for him. The plan was to leave after we finished classes on Friday afternoon. We would spend Friday and Saturday night in the woods and get back home on Sunday. I was absolutely dreading this. I put on old clothes, ones that I didn't care if they got dirty, and strapped on a pair of hiking boots that Charlie bought me. We gathered our things up and then got into Charlie's Jeep to pick up Jake. As we drove through the forest, the guys chatted excitedly about the trip while I sat in silence. Eventually, we reached the parking lot at the edge of the forest. There were no other cars there, which was not a surprise to me. Who wanted to go hiking in this weather? It had been drizzling all day. We got out of the car, strapped on our backpacks, and began making our way through the woods. Since once we got deeper into the woods, we wouldn't be able to use the GPS on our phones, Charlie was relying on a paper map. Occasionally, he would hand it to Jake, who would double check that we were going in the right direction. The woods were thick, and with the gray sky overhead, it was pretty dark. It felt like we had been walking for hours, and I was sure I had blisters on both of my feet. The boys, who had been chatting excitedly at first, were now more quiet. There was a certain spot in the woods where we were planning to set up camp. Once we got there, it would be a short walking distance away from a small lake. The boys would be able to get all the rock and soil samples they would need there.
What if the boys are planning something and they're like the predators or something like that? You know what I'm saying?
I could tell it was taking us longer to get there than the boys had expected. They were arguing a little, something that was completely unlike them. Jake kept saying we were going in the wrong direction, but Charlie insisted he knew where we were. I could tell it was getting late because it was even harder to see where we were going. It had gotten so dark. At last, Charlie let out a loud groan. We need to pitch a tent now and call it a night. If we wait any longer, it'll be too dark. We just have to try again in the morning. Charlie got the tent set up while Jake started a fire so we could have some dinner. Our dinner was a can of beans each, and my stomach was still grumbling when I was finished, but I kept quiet.
Aww. So she needed more food than just beans. Shoot, they should have brought some other canned good foods.
We decided to go to bed early that night. We all slept in the same clothes we had been wearing and let the fire burn outside of our tent to try and make the cold more manageable. I curled myself up against Charlie in my sleeping bag and held on to him for body heat, but it didn't make the cold any less miserable. Right when I thought I had almost managed to get to sleep, I heard a strange screaming sound that sounded far away. It caused me to sit up straight. "What's wrong?" Charlie murmured, clearly still only half awake. "Jake, where's Jake?" Charlie sat up and looked around the tent. He seemed surprised to notice that Jake's sleeping bag was empty. "Jake?" He crawled to the entrance of the tent, unzipped it, and then called out Jake's name again. The sound that followed was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard in my life. It was Jake's voice, but he was screaming like he was being tortured. I could
they done went out to the woods and it's crazy people out there or something.
Only identify one of the words that he was screaming, and it was help. I put my hands over my ears because I couldn't stand another second of the screaming. "Stay here," Charlie hissed at me as he climbed out of the tent, as if I could even dream of
Charlie's next.
leaving what little safety I had left. I climbed as far down into my sleeping bag as I could and tried to pretend that I was invisible. It felt like hours before Charlie came back to the tent. Tears were staining his cheeks, and he was cut up, scratches covering his face. I crawled over to him, my heart beating faster than I had ever thought possible. "Are you okay?" He looked stunned and was unable to speak at first.
What?
I couldn't find him. I could hear him screaming and I kept running towards his voice, but then he went quiet. I couldn't see anything and I kept running into things. I grabbed his hand to try and make him feel better. We tried to piece together what could have happened. Jake must have woken up and had to go to the bathroom, so he left the tent. Something must have gotten him, a bear, a mountain lion, something. He was either dead.
He never would. I'd be like, I don't know, I can't do no like hiking trip and be in the woods all alone where there is like nobody or like just, you know what I'm saying? I can't do that. Like it's be creepy people out there trying to hurt people. Like no.
Or laying around severely injured now. I was shaking. I was so scared, and all I wanted to do was get out of these woods and go home. Whenever we reached self-service, we would be able to call 911. Maybe there would still be hope for Jake. But Charlie insisted that we couldn't go anywhere until the daylight. It would be too hard to get out of the woods in the dark, and whatever had attacked Jake was still out there. The rest of the night was absolutely miserable. All we could do was huddle together, listen to the sound of the rain pouring on our tent, and hope that whatever predator was out there wasn't coming for us next. Sleep was no longer a possibility.
Nah, bruh. I will pack up my things and go. I'm out. Like, I'm not, soon the morning comes, sun out. Shoot, pack up stuff, go, never return there again.
It felt like ages before the light finally began to come into our tent. It was finally morning. Charlie was organizing our things so that we would be ready to go as soon as possible. All of a sudden, I heard him gasp, and I turned to see what was wrong. "The map," he said in a panicked voice. "Jake must have taken the map with him because it's not here."
Oh.
Charlie was pacing around the tent.
So now they're lost? They're lost in the woods? And nobody's around? Like, what the heck?
While I sat on the ground and tried to avoid having a panic attack. Finally, he seemed to calm down. He told me he thought he could find the way. He studied the map before we left, and he remembered most of it. Feeling slightly more hopeful, we climbed out of the tent and got ready to go. I was the first one out of the tent, so I saw it first. It was the most horrible sight I had ever
Saw what?
seen. It was Jake. I could tell by the clothes, even though a bag had been placed over his head. He had been tied up high in the trees with ropes. His clothes were tattered and covered in blood. I knew this.
That's tragic. Dude, oh my gosh, he was brutally murdered.
This was not the work of an animal, but something much darker. Charlie grabbed my arm and began pulling me forward. I could tell he was in a state of shock because he didn't cry. "We need to go now," We left the tent behind, only bothering to carry our backpacks. Charlie would have me continuously check my phone to see if I could get any service, but I would only do so every 30 minutes or so in hopes of making my battery last as long as possible. Every time I checked, there was still no service. I had no idea if we were going the right way or not. I just had to trust that Charlie knew what he was doing. We had been walking for several hours when all of a sudden there was a horrific howl coming from somewhere in the woods behind us. It didn't sound like an animal, but like something more demonic. It took everything in me not to scream. We took off running as fast as we could, the howls getting louder.
Is there such thing as human zombies?
And louder. Whatever it was getting closer to us. Charlie urged me to keep running. At one point, I looked over my shoulder and saw a creature that looked like it belonged in a nightmare. It looked like a giant gorilla standing at least 10 feet tall. It had fangs instead of teeth. In its hand was Jake's baseball cap.
You best believe I'm jetting through the woods. I don't care. I'm jetting.
I screamed at the top of my lungs and began running even faster. At last, there was a clearing, and to my amazement, I saw Charlie's Jeep parked right where we had left it. I immediately dialed 911. When we got back to town, we spent hours talking to detectives and park rangers about what we had experienced. Rangers combed the forest and were able to retrieve Jake's body, but could find no sign of the creature that killed him. To this day, the creature still roams the woods free. Every night, I hear his tortured screams in my dreams.
Wow. That's story 2.
When I was in high school, there was this kid named Ricky. Ricky was the outsider of our grade. He had acne, was obsessed with anime, and simply didn't even try to fit in. Kids were mean to him, and I mean, really mean.
He probably didn't care. He'd probably rather be himself than anything.
They would write terrible notes on his locker, put thumbtacks on his seat, and mess with his lunch when he wasn't looking. He didn't do anything to fight back. I felt terrible for him, and went out of my way to try and be as nice as possible to him. There was a tradition at our school that the seniors would take part in every year. A few weeks before graduation, everyone would have a campout outside the school. We would roast hot dogs and make s'mores. There were always a few kids that would sneak some booze in. It was a great way to bond with everyone one last time before we all went our separate ways in college. On the Friday of the campout, Ricky sat down in his usual seat next to me in history class. I tried to make polite small talk with him. "You going to the campout tonight?" I asked him, figuring the answer was probably no. Ricky had a strange look on his face.
"I might show up later,"
he muttered. "You should, it's gonna be fun," I encouraged him. He just stared at me with an expression that I couldn't quite read.
He probably thinking yeah, I don't do parties like that, but I might show up.
That night at the campout, I was gathered around a campfire with some of my close girlfriends. I was glancing around looking to see if I could spot Ricky, but he was nowhere in sight. I felt a little disappointed. It was yet another high school memory he was missing out on. Before long, it got late, and my friends and I decided to call it a night. All 3 of us would be sleeping in the same tent. There were still a few groups of people hanging out and laughing, so I decided to put some earplugs in so I could block out the noise. It took me a while to adjust to sleeping on the ground, but eventually I drifted off to sleep. I was jolted awake by the sound of screaming. I yanked the earplugs out of my ears and grabbed my phone, using it to light up the tent. My friends all looked terrified. "What the heck is that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Maybe some guys are playing a prank on the girls," one of my friends said, but I didn't think this was right.
Nah, this is real.
I could tell the screams were screams of terror. I'm going out there to figure out what's going on, but my friends grabbed onto me tightly, not letting me go. The screams were getting louder, and they were getting closer to us. "I'm calling 911, my friend muttered, grabbing her phone. Suddenly, the entrance to our tent was unzipped, causing all 3
Is there no service?
of us to scream. I recognized the person immediately. It was a girl named Jillian. She was from my math class. There was blood splattered across her face and her blonde hair sticking out all over. "Jillian, what happened?" "It's Ricky," she sobbed. "He's got a gun and he shot everyone in my tent. I think they're dead. I don't know why he didn't shoot me." My heart was thudding in my chest. How could this be true? Had Ricky finally snapped? We need to make a run for it, I said. No, Jillian hissed. He'll shoot us the second we do. The zipper of our tent was ripped only a few seconds later. We all huddled together, shaking. Ricky stood at the entrance of our tent, but he didn't look like Ricky anymore. There was blood covering his clothing, ammo strapped to his chest, and he had a crazed look on his face.
He's a murderer. He's a psycho murderer.
I reached my arms out to protect my friends, adrenaline running through my veins. Please, Ricky, I begged. Don't do this. Remember who you are. Ricky hesitated for a moment before calling out my name in a shaking voice.
Maria? Is that you?
Yes, it's me. Please don't hurt us.
Oh, do you got split personalities? Cause why he acting like he don't know who she is?
This isn't who you are. Trying to make my voice sound as calm as possible. Suddenly, I heard sniffling, and I realized I was crying. I decided to try one more time to get through to him. Please, Ricky, put the gun down. Ricky hesitated a moment before finally outstretching his hand and handing me the loaded weapon. I thanked him and took it from him. The next thing I knew, he had taken off running into the night. Jillian burst into tears beside me. My friend was still on the phone with 911, who told us to stay in our tents until help arrived. Much to my relief, the sound of police sirens filled the air a few moments later. The officer's eyes filled with shock as he saw the gun laying on the floor of our tent.
And Ricky was never to be found. That's what I'm guessing.
He told us to all put our hands in the air and make our way into the school, where we would wait until we were considered safe to leave. We did as we were told. I could hardly believe the carnage that was all around us as soon as we left the tent. Lifeless bodies were laying on the ground, and people were being loaded up into stretchers. They found Ricky a short time later, and he confessed to everything.
Oh, they found him?
7 people had been killed during his bloody rampage. It seemed that he had been targeting the people who had made fun of him the last 4 years. I know what Ricky did was wrong and terrible,
Wow.
and I feel awful for the families of the kids who died. But somehow, I also find myself feeling bad for Ricky too. He was bullied for years, and now will spend the rest of his life in a jail cell. I knew in my heart that this
It
was
don't take much to ruin your life, you know?
something that could have been prevented. I'm grateful every day that he allowed me to live another day.
Story 3.
When I was a little kid, my elementary school playground bordered a forest. Going into the forest was very much against the rules, and everyone was told that they needed to always stay where a teacher could see them. Of course, there were a lot of kids, and the teachers couldn't.
No way am I gonna go to a school and then just walk in a forest, knowing that it be adults and weird people creeping around schools because they be trying to kidnap little kids. The forest is probably one of them. I wouldn't do it.
Always keep their eyes on everyone all of the time. Every recess, there were at least a couple kids that would venture out into the woods. The forest was considered a place of adventure, and the further you could get in without being caught, the cooler you were.
Wow.
I was about 12 years old at the time, and I was very much a teacher's pet. I didn't do anything to get in trouble and always stayed on top of my schoolwork. That was until I met Chris, a kid who was also in the 4th grade like me, but in a different class. Chris was an extremely talented artist who would pass me little handmade items whenever we passed each other in the hallway. Sometimes it was an origami crane, and other times it was a drawing or a handwritten letter. I had the biggest crush on him. On one particular day, Chris passed me in between classes and told me that my surprise was hidden in the tallest oak tree, just inside the forest.
Wow. So she gonna go inside the forest with this boy.
I was immediately nervous. I knew how much trouble I could get in if I was caught going into the forest, but I also knew how much I was desperate to see what Chris had left me. During recess that day, I took a look around, and the second that I knew all the teachers had their backs turned, I raced into the forest at full speed. I knew just the tree Chris had been talking about. It was way taller than any of the other trees near the outskirts of the forest. I found it without any problems and quickly saw what Chris had left me. It was a tiny, hand-painted Christmas ornament of an angel hanging from one of the lower branches. I smiled and reached out to grab it when all of a sudden, I felt a set of strong hands gripping my waist. I immediately went into panic mode and began fighting and kicking as hard as I could. When I looked over my shoulder,
That's why you don't just go into no goddamn woods.
I could see my attacker. It was a middle-aged man. He was dressed strangely. He was wearing a wolf costume, like the kind you would get for Halloween, even though it was nowhere near Halloween. When I realized I was much too weak to fight him off, I did the only thing I could think of. I sunk my teeth right into his arm. I knew I had hurt him badly when I felt his blood fill my mouth. The bite caused him to release me, and I took off running back towards my school. The second I got to a teacher, I explained what happened, and the police were called immediately. When they arrived at my school, they told me I was a very lucky girl, and that if I hadn't fought as hard as I could...
She was smart, though. That's I guess the only thing she really felt she could do.
I would have likely ended up dead in some shallow grave in the woods. Never again did I enter those woods without an adult. If you liked this video, check out the other recent videos on Anna Horror.
Wow. Thank you guys for watching. Stay tuned. I'll be back with more videos. I'm out.